Good afternoon, class. I'm recording in my home office or den or whatever you want to call it. Here, beautiful Saturday. I actually had to close the blinds to keep the glare from blocking out my face. So I hope you appreciate that I'm taking time from my day of running around my backyard to let you guys know about the lead up to World War II. Now, of course, last class period, we were discussing the lead up to World War II, and we didn't really get into it, so let's start from the very beginning, kind of to refresh our memory. So this slide will go through very quickly and start talking about what happened to start World War II. Now to refresh our memories from previous lectures, the effects of the Versailles Treaty that was signed in 1919 stripped Germany, as we can see here, my little pointer, of Alsace-Lorraine, parts of Silesia, shrinking what had been pre-war Germany down. It, of course, had destroyed the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, replacing it with Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and expanded Romania. And, of course, Poland was created along with Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia from the ashes of the former Russian Empire. So Soviet Union, Russia used to be way over here, Soviet Union was over here. Now, it's not just the loss of territory that hurt Germany. Their government was in disarray. Because before World War I, Germany was a monarchy that also had not a constitution, but a parliament. They did not have a constitution, but they did have a parliament. The Kaiser was the symbolic figurehead, the head of the military, the focus of German political authority. While the Reichstag passed laws of taxation and things like that, they were secondary to the Kaiser. However, between the Armistice of 1918 and the Peace Treaty of 1919, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicates and flees to exile here in the Netherlands. Wilhelm II would die in, I believe it's 36 or 37, just prior to the beginning of World War II. Now, it's not just the reduction of political authority. Germany cannot have a military to the same degree that the other countries have. The Versailles Treaty dictated that the Germans could not have a navy, could not have an air force, and their army was limited to 100,000 men. Now, of course, the German army had been the pride of the Germans. The fact that they were a land power that dominated Central Europe was now gone. They had been stripped of their identity. So this is one reason why, with the end of World War I, Germany falls into, well, I have political upheaval here on the screen, but that is an understatement. In 1918, the Independent Social Democratic Party, led by Kurt Eisner, tried to break Bavaria, this part of Germany right down here, closest to Austria, away from Germany, declaring the German Soviet Free State, a communist country modeled on the Soviet Union. They did this in November of 1919 on the one-year anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, the problem for the Germans is that this is during a time period where they're having to rapidly pull men off the front and demobilize them according to the Armistice and then later the Peace Treaty. So how do you bring this part of Germany back into the fold without an army, with a country that in all of the major cities you see communist uprisings? Well, this provisional German government of just the parliament had to make a deal with the devil, because many of the German troops that were being demobilized could not find jobs. they socially could not fit back into German society. Many of them, their adult years had been formed in the front lines, in the trenches. Whereas most of you are learning to be adults by being in college, having a job, taking on adult responsibilities. These young German men had learned to be adults in a military organization where they took orders and killed people. And of course, they looked for that same camaraderie, that same culture after the war. And so in many German cities, you see the rise of what were known as Freikorps, or free armies, basically armed gangs. And the German provisional government had to make a deal with these Freikorps that they would help police German cities, freeing up the forces of the legitimate government to battle and bring Bavaria back into Germany. Now, this deal with the devil almost destroys this new Germany of the post-World War I era. Because in 1920, actually in March 13th of 1920, Wolfgang Kapp, K-A-P-P, led 5,000 Freikorps members, armed to the teeth, and tried to take over Berlin, to try and stage a coup. Now, the Freikorps were hyper-nationalistic. They wanted to restore Germany to its former glory. They were militaristic. Many Freikorps members will go on to join the brown shirts of the National Socialist Party, which we'll talk about here in just a few minutes. This, of course, forces the German government that at the time was trying to hammer out a new constitution to redefine Germany politically. It forces them to flee Berlin to the resort community of Weimar. This is why between 1924 and the rise of Nazi Germany in 1933, Germany is known as the Weimar Republic, because it is a republic that has its constitution signed in Weimar, Germany, even though the capital remains Berlin, because the Germans will get the Freikorps pushed out. They'll win against them. But what kind of image does this set? This pretends a republic that is very weak, unstable, and of course this means that many Germans do not place much faith in their republic. However, by 1923, the new Weimar Republic has a new chancellor, a fellow by the name of Gustav Stresemann. Stresemann actually goes to the United States, meets with Vice President Charles Dawes, Vice President under Calvin Coolidge, and works out what becomes known as the Dawes Plan. The Dawes Plan is something that I've talked about in other classes, and we may have talked about in class. The Dawes Plan was where American banks, guaranteed by the U.S. federal government, would loan money to Germany. And then, of course, this would allow the Germans to have extra cash to not only pay back the reparations to Great Britain and France, but also to have money for their own economy, so that they could rebuild Germany without having to have high taxes. This, of course, leads to at least a period within German history that is relatively stable. Germany appears to be the country that is prospering the most during the 1920s. But this is all a facade based on loans and credit. The 1929 stock market crash destroys that system. Money quits flowing from American banks to Germany. However, the British and the French, their own economic problems forcing them to, of course, demand that reparations continue to be paid, this destroys the German economy. What happens in 1929 and 1930 is even worse than what happens in the United States. And we talked about how bad it was in this country, with 1/4 of the population completely out of work. Imagine hyperinflation. Hyperinflation in Germany was so bad that German workers demanded to be paid twice a day, once at lunch and once when they got off work. Not at the end of the week, not at the end of the month. Because the money was depreciating so quickly, it was losing its value so quickly, that if they waited to the end of the day, the money that they made early in the morning could have bought more stuff in the afternoon than in the evening. So what they would do is they would get paid and they would run out on their lunch breaks, give the money to their wives. Their wives would go and buy whatever they could with the money because it would not buy as much later on that day or the next day. By 1930, German Reichsmarks were worthless. They were being used by German women to start fires in their kitchen stoves. And of course, this means that Germans could not afford to buy anything because prices were insanely high because of the lack of value of the German money. It means that Germans were out of work, even to a greater scale than Americans were. It means that Germans were going hungry and they were becoming desperate. And when they looked to their own government, what did they see? All they saw was multiple parties fighting with each other, blaming each other, rather than solving the problem. This, of course, leads to fascism. Fascism, which had its roots in 18th century corporatism, is a political ideology that takes elements of both old ideologies but also new ideologies. Fascists worship the state. They believe that the state is the ultimate expression of human civilization. But this state is more than just the government. The state is a representation of the people, just as the old kings during the Middle Ages supposedly represented their people. Excuse me. Excuse me. However, who were the people? Now, for fascists, the people are a collectivist entity unto themselves. The people are not, in the classical liberal sense, a conglomeration or a grouping of individuals. Instead, the people are independent of individuals. The people are the community. And for different fascists, the people or the community is defined differently. However, fascists tend to define the people or community along national or even racial lines. The first truly fascist state in Europe was not Germany. Instead, it was Italy. Let's see here. Hold on. In 1922, Benito Mussolini, this man right here, led his black shirts, young, fervent Italian fascist, led his black shirts on a march, what became known as the March on Rome. The March on Rome was a show of power. They didn't overthrow the government. They didn't attack the government. Instead, in 1922, this March of Rome was intended to show the solidarity and power of the fascist party in Italy. And by the end of 1922, the people of Italy would vote Benito Mussolini into government. He would become, in effect, the Prime Minister of Italy. And by 1923, he would become what was known as El Duce, or the leader. Now, you might still be asking, what is fascism? Fascism comes from the word fascisti. Fascisti is a Latin word that has its origins in Rome, ancient Rome. The fascisti was the symbol of power given to Roman dictators during the time period of the Republic, when, during times of war, the Republican Senate would give a single individual absolute power for 6 months to a year. This fascisti symbolized all the power of the people of Rome, symbolized by the fact that the fascisti was made up of twigs. Twigs that were bound to the axe by a strap. The strap represented government, the community. The hatchet, or the axe, represented the power of the state. So the people were bound to the state via the dictator for the collective good. And Mussolini and the fascists take this symbology, the symbolic nature of the fascisti, literally, that we as individuals are twigs and weak and they're easily broken, that only by being bound together to the state, by what they said, what the fascists believed was the power of the party, the leather strap, could the community survive and prosper. So, in effect, this is a collectivist ideology, but it's not a leftist collectivist ideology. It isn't socialism, and it is not communism. We'll talk about what communism is here in a minute. It is, in effect, a collectivist right, even though fascism it's very similar to radical socialism. Benito Mussolini, before he founded the Italian Fascist Party, was an Italian socialist. For a little extra credit, I want you guys to watch a video that is available on YouTube. It's actually a Russian documentary, but it is in English, except for they don't dub when they interview Russians, so when they talk to people, you really lose what they're talking about. But it's called The Soviet Story. And the Soviet story chronicles the rise of both European fascism, especially German National Socialism, as well as Soviet Bolshevism or Soviet communism. And it shows how these two ideologies, who, as we will see, stood against each other historically, are ideologically cousins. They are almost identical except for certain aspects. Now, a person who was actually watching Benito Mussolini and his March on Rome in 1922 was this man right here. Of course, this is Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler is an interesting individual in that he was a failed artist before World War I. He served with distinction and won the Knight's Cross twice in World War I. He was wounded by gas. This is one reason why he prefers to use gas against those that he considers to be Germany's enemies, most notably the Jews. However, he is, like many German soldiers, unable to find work after, of course, the war. He is one of the lucky ones. He is actually still in the German army in 1919. In 1919, he is actually recruited by the new Weimar government. Because after the Cat Push, the German government is paranoid. It's concerned about fringe groups. And Hitler is sent to spy upon the National Socialist Party, a small party that had formed in Bavaria. The same Bavaria that, of course, the communists had tried to break away just a few years before. Now, Hitler, of course, would find this party to find that originally this party is only made up of less than 20 individuals. It's incredibly small. The people that make it up are intellectuals, failed artists like himself, ruffians off the street, occultists, people that are interested in the occult, for example. A very hodgepodge of individuals. However, their ideology, Hitler finds, well, similar to his own. He not only joins the party as a spy, he rises through the ranks, not spying on the National Socialist Party, but instead leading it. He quits his job with the government to lead what becomes known after he changes the name, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi for short, begins to lead it as it agitates for political and social revolution in the streets of southern Germany, most notably Bavaria and its major city, Munich. In 1923, following the example of Mussolini's black shirts, Hitler will lead his brown shirts, paramilitary ruffians that wear brown shirts and military-style uniforms, leads them on a similar march to try and seize the government of Munich. This becomes known as the Beer Hall Putsch because the Nazi Party literally had its headquarters in a beer hall, and that's where they set out from. Now, this march on Munich is put down by the German authorities. Hitler is arrested, barely avoids being shot during the putsch itself, is arrested and is jailed for treason, a crime that carries with it a capital offense. However, many of the German jurors, many of the judges sympathize with the ideas of this new Nazi party, and thus they reduce Hitler's jail time, not from capital punishment, not even to years, but to 9 months. So in 1930, 1923, 1924, Hitler is in jail, whereupon his personal secretary, a fellow by the name of Rudolf Hess, will copy and type his, I'll call them rantings, that will be published later on in a book called Mein Kampf, which is published in I believe 24 or 25. Actually, here's my copy right here. It's not that I'm a believer in fascism. It's just that I believe you should know your enemy. Actually, 1927. Now, what is in Mein Kampf that allows Hitler to change this thuggish street gang to a political party? Well, he crystallizes the ideas of Nazism in Mein Kampf. It is a very hard read, and I'm not going to read the entire thing to you because, as you can see, it's a pretty big book. But I want you to hear what his ideas of the state, the government, are. I quote, "The state is a means to an end. Its end lies in the preservation and advancement of a community of physically and psychically," I don't know what he means by psychically, "physically and psychically homogeneous creatures. This preservation itself comprises first of all existence as a race, and thereby permits the free deployment of all forces dormant in this race. Of them, a part will always primarily serve the preservation of physical life, and the only remaining part of the promotion of further spiritual development. Actually, the one always creates the precondition for the other. States which do not serve this purpose are misbegotten monstrosities, in fact. The fact of their existence changes this no more than the success of a gang of bandits can justify robbery. We National Socialists, as champions of a new philosophy of life, must never base ourselves on so-called accepted facts. If we did, we would not be the champions of the great new idea. But the coolies of the present day lie." So the Nazis view themselves as the precursor to a new society, to not buy into the old lies, as Hitler says, but instead to champion the new life, the new society. And so, what is this new society that Hitler champions? Well, of course, fascism is nationalism. Nationalism in its most malignant, paranoid state. So if lightweight nationalism is nothing more than patriotism, fascist nationalism views anyone that is not defined as one of the community, physically homogeneous creatures, to be the enemy of that community. And the state must defend the community against these enemies. Now, Hitler, of course, does not focus just on this during his numerous speeches in the late 1920s and early 1930s. He focuses on the inability of the Weimar government to fix any problems. This, of course, this is reinforced by the crash of 1929 and the ineffectual nature of the Weimar government. But even before then, many Germans that were turned off by Weimar culture, by the fact that during the 1920s, between 24 and 29, Germany was liberalizing, that German culture was becoming, well, more free, less orderly, and many German conservatives viewed this with disdain, and they embraced Hitler. One reason why Hitler was able to come to power in 1932 with only 37% of the vote was that for the short term, he allied the Nazis with the conservative German, Catholic Socialist Party, or Social Catholic Party. This was a conservative party that believed that Weimar culture, this more liberal culture of the 1920s, was destroying traditional German culture. And so they ally with the Nazis, believing that the Nazis, of course, will help them restore German traditional ideas. Other Germans hope that the Nazis will help restore German authority and its place in the world, its power, its prestige. In 1933, Hitler becomes Chancellor, the same position that Gustav Stresemann held back in 1923. As Chancellor, he is head of the Parliament. However, he is not head of the government. Under the Weimar Constitution, the head of the Parliament is the Chancellor. The head of the government is the President. And until 1935, that is World War I hero, former general, Paul von Hindenburg. And Hindenburg particularly despises Hitler. He calls him that stupid little Bavarian corporal. And he believes the fascists to be nothing more than a crazy fringe group that will destroy Germany. Now, who are these enemies that, of course, the Nazis speak to? Well, German fascism is incredibly racist in its views. It believes that race and the conflict between racial groups is what drives history. It is an ideology that embraces social Darwinism and eugenics, this belief that humanity is developing from less developed human beings to more developed human beings, and of course races are the determinants of that progression. Now, not only do the Nazis look down upon non-Aryans, as the Nazis call them, the so-called 6-foot-tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryans. Not only do they look down upon those that do not fit into those racial stereotypes, they reserve their hatred for one group in particular. So while they despise the Slavs in the East, the Slavic peoples that make up Russia, for example, the Gypsies of Romania, and other Untermensch, or subhumans, they reserve their hatred for the Jews. And let me read to you what Hitler thinks of Jewish people. The Jewish people's instinct of self-preservation is no smaller but larger than other people's. If his intellectual facilities can easily arouse the impression that they are equal to the intellectual gifts of other races, he lacks completely the most essential requirement of a cultured people, the idealistic attitude. In the Jewish people, the will to self-sacrifice does not go beyond the individual's naked instinct for self-preservation. Their apparent great sense of solidarity is based on their very primitive herd instinct that is seen in many other living creatures in this world. To what extent the Jew takes over foreign culture, imitating or rather ruining it, can be seen from the fact that he is mostly found in the arts, which require the least innovation, the art of acting. But even here, in reality, he is only a juggler, or rather an ape. For even here, he lacks the last touch that required for real genius. Even here, he is no creative genius, but a superficial imitator. And all the twists and tricks that he uses are powerless to conceal the inner lifelessness of his own creative gift. Here, the Jewish press must lovingly help him along by rousing such a roar of hosannas about even the most mediocre bungler, just so long that he is a Jew. The rest of the world actually ends up thinking that they have an artist before them. The Jew possesses no culture-creating force of any sort, without which there is no true higher development of man. Let's see here, hold on. Hence, his intellect will never have a constructive effect, but will be destructive. And in the very rare cases, perhaps, at most he is stimulating. But then he is the prototype of the force which always wants evil and nothing good. This idea that Jews are nothing more than leeches and parasites is central to the Nazi ideology. Because when Hitler becomes chancellor, he starts pushing for a program to defend Germany from its internal enemies as much as its external ones. Now, of course, he runs up against the president, Hindenburg. However, in 1935, Hindenburg dies, allowing Hitler, as head of the parliament, to pass a series of laws that become known as the Enabling Acts, combining the position of Chancellor and President into one position. In English, this new position roughly translates to the leader. In German, it is called Der Führer. And Der Führer, under the Enabling Acts, has dictatorial power, able to pass laws without a majority in the German parliament. So between 1935 and the beginning of the war in 1939, Hitler declares a national state of emergency, giving himself, of course, more power, begins to highly centralize the German state, eliminates all unions and other organizations that are not directly controlled by the Nazi Party. So the Nazi Party's unions, the Nazi Party organizations can stay in place, but organizations like independent labor unions or the Boy Scouts are disbanded, thrown out of Germany, and either, well, left to, nothing replaces them, or, for example, the Boy Scouts are replaced by the Hitler Youth. The Hitler Youth, of course, are directly controlled by the Nazi Party being directly controlled by Adolf Hitler, so the Hitler Youth, in effect, are led directly by Hitler. The Nazis take over all police forces. So instead of your local police reporting to the local mayor, instead, mayors, the police forces, everybody in Germany reports to the national government. And as we've said, fascist society is a paranoid society. A society where there is always an enemy, always someone trying to destroy this new culture, this German utopia, where they will create the Übermensch, or superhuman race. But the Germans are not alone in their paranoid mentality. While they champion nationalism, another totalitarian state, another paranoid state, will rise in the interwar period. I know this is not in the slides, but I think we need to discuss it since I have you here anyway. And it will not be based on nationalism, but instead based on Marxism. Let's talk about the rise of the Soviet Union. Before World War I, the leader and sole leader of Russia was this man right here. This is Tsar Nicholas II. Interestingly enough, the reason why he looks very much like his cousin, King, let's see here, which one was it? King, oh, Lord have mercy. I can't remember which king was in World War I. The British monarch of World War I. I apologize for, let's see here. It was not an Edward. Let's see here. It was a George. King George V was his cousin, both of which were grandchildren of Queen Victoria, who had reigned in Britain in the latter part of the 19th century, the 1800s. Now, Nicholas II was a true believer in the autocratic monarchy that Russia had. And during World War I, he would finally take direct control of his armies due to the failures of his generals. The problem is, Russia would continue to lose. And without anybody else to blame, the Russians begin to blame him for the severe losses, the casualties of World War I. They start to blame him for the fact that people are starting to starve because Russia was not able to supply either its armies with munitions nor its civilian populations with the necessary goods of life. In 1917, in February, he is forced to abdicate and is replaced by a provisional government made up of moderate middle-class Russians, businessmen, intellectuals, people like that. However, they were an incredibly small part of the Russian population, and they believed that they had to keep Russia in the war. That after the war, if they stayed with the Allies and were victorious, that the Allies would allow them part of the spoils of victory, and this would facilitate reform and more democracy in Russia. But after the war, Russians were ready for peace and reform now. This was the man who was willing to give it to them. Since we're not really concerned with Russian history, I'm not going to expect you guys to know this right here. I want you to know who these are. This is Vladimir Ivanovich Lenin, or V.I. Lenin. Lenin was the head of the Russian Bolshevik Party. The Bolsheviks were different from the other radical groups, like the Mensheviks and the Social Revolution Party, in that they did not serve in the new provisional government that was formed in February of 1917. Instead, the Bolsheviks refused to serve, believing this just to be a bone thrown to the population. The Bolsheviks were hardcore believers in Marxism, the belief that class revolution would lead to the communist utopia. As a result, taking part in a non-communist government was just selling out. Now, one reason why the Bolsheviks, despite being smaller than the other parties, were so effective was because they had an exclusive membership where you had to have somebody who was already a Bolshevik vouch for your good, your trustworthiness, to avoid being infiltrated by the Tsarist secret police before the February Revolution. They were also incredibly highly organized, believing that the party, the Bolshevik Party, would act as the vanguard party, leading the peasants toward the communist revolution. Because Marxism requires an industrial economy, and it requires workers. Russia, of course, did not have workers. So Lenin, his take on Marxism, this is why it's known as Marxist-Leninism, his take on Marxism was that the Bolshevik Party would force the peasants, because the peasants are ignorant and stupid, would force them into the revolution and convert them into the workers, and thus facilitate the communist revolution. So the real revolution happens as the Bolsheviks take over the workers' councils that are set up after the February Revolution. The provisional government, led by the moderates, were still unable to provide leadership and the basic necessities in life. So in the cities, most notably St. Petersburg, the workers set up their own councils. They call them Soviets. The Bolsheviks take these Soviets over and in effect take over the real power in the urban centers of Russia. Now, the Communist Revolution or Bolshevik Revolution in Russia is actually facilitated by the Germans themselves. The Germans know that the Bolsheviks would be highly disruptive to any war effort, especially the new and still weak moderate government in Germany. So in the summer of 1917, they ship in a cattle car Lenin from his exile in Switzerland to just outside of St. Petersburg, because that's how close the German armies were. Let him off so that he can go through the German lines into the Russian lines and then make his way to St. Petersburg, which he does. There, his oratory and his leadership skills help cause the Bolshevik Revolution of October 25th, 1917. Now, why is Lenin so popular? Well, he promises peace, bread to the urban working class, and land to the peasantry. And thus, in March of 1918, the Bolsheviks make a deal. Again, if I can go back here to the map here, they give up all of this territory to the Germans at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Of course, after World War I, the Germans don't get to keep this territory, and the Allies don't want to give it back to the Bolsheviks because they hate the Bolsheviks, they hate the new communists. So what do? They allow these people to create Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, these national identities, create or recreate their own countries. Now, between 1917 and 1921, the Russians will fight a civil war amongst themselves. Because even though the Bolsheviks seize St. Petersburg, they seize the major urban areas, out in the countryside, you still have resistance to this communist takeover. You still have people who support the moderate government. You even still have people who support the Tsar. This is why in 1918, the Bolsheviks murder Nicholas II and his entire family to destroy the rationale for resistance of those that support the monarchy. Those that oppose the communist revolution become known as the white forces. Those that support the communist revolution are known as the Reds. And by 1921, the newly formed Red Army is victorious. Now, Stalin, Joseph Stalin, was a confidant and immediate subordinate to V.I. Lenin. He was one of three individuals that had Lenin's ear. The other major competitor for power to Stalin was a fellow by the name of Leon Trotsky. Now, when Lenin dies in, let's see, I'm trying to think when Lenin dies. It's 1927, I think. Let's see here. Let's give you accurate dates here. Actually, take that back. He dies in 1924. Between 1924 and 1927, there is a struggle for power between Trotsky and his supporters and Stalin and his supporters. Stalin is the one that comes out on top. One of the major reasons why Stalin comes out on top is his ability to use extreme violence. This is a man who I think knew he was evil and didn't care. I mean, this is a man who coldly will order the deaths of millions of his countrymen. Because in 1929, Stalin will implement the first of his 5-year plans. What is a 5-year plan? Well, a 5-year plan is designed to rapidly industrialize Russia. It concentrates on building things like steel mills, heavy equipment production, hydroelectric dams, railroads, road construction, and things like that. It is centrally controlled from Moscow, the new capital of the Soviet Union. It focuses on heavy industry at the expense of consumer goods. This is why in, the Soviet Union, you looked at old pictures of the Soviet Union, everybody drove the same car. Everybody wore the same clothes. Because during the first 5-year plan, they didn't even make things like cars. They made clothes, but they were all identical, the same exact style in a limited number of sizes. In 1930 alone, the Soviet Union makes billions of shoes, all of one size, all of one style. So I believe the size in the West would be something around a size 10, which means that somebody with my feet, a size 12.5, would have difficulty finding shoes. It means that the Soviet population had to do without. But that's all right, because in Bolshevism, in Marxist-Leninism, the good of the individual is irrelevant. The good of the whole, or the class, is what is important. And according to Stalin, the good of the community was best served by rapid industrialization, by centralizing control, by collectivizing farming, where people who had farmed as individual families out in the fields were herded into new cities that were built just for them. And like their industrial counterparts, they lived in apartments to be shipped out to the countryside to work in collective fields. Now, this was relatively easy to do early on because most of the farmers in Russia prior to World War I were landless peasants who rented. They basically changed one landlord for another. They were easily brought over to the Bolshevik side because Stalin targeted the kulak class. The kulaks were small farmers who just happened to own their own land, something that the vast majority of the peasant farmers did not have. So while these people were not wealthy, they had their own land, something that went against this communist ideology. So the kulaks were painted in the Soviet press as being the oppressors, as being the people who kept down the peasant class. And of course, the Bolsheviks didn't have to destroy the kulaks, did not have to kill them. The peasants did this for them. They held impromptu kangaroo courts where these kulaks were put on trial by Soviet judges, but then the sentence was already determined and would be carried out by the radicalized peasants. However, by 1931 and 1932, the need for food in the booming cities of Russia, the industrial cities of Russia, was so great that Stalin ordered greater quantities to be basically taken from the Soviet agricultural workers, the former peasants. When they refused, the Red Army was sent in to basically requisition all the food that was necessary to keep the urban workers alive, even at the expense of starving the rural agricultural workers. This is why in 1932 there was famine in the Soviet countryside. Millions of Russians would die even before World War II started. During Stalin's reign, more than 50 million Soviet citizens, but we know for sure of 25, but there's a possibility as high as 50, died in famine, in the Great Purges, in being killed because they stood against the Soviet state or appeared to stand against the Soviet state. As we will see, thousands will be killed because they appear to be against this new Soviet collective. Now, of course, your average Soviet did not hear about the famine in the countryside. Instead, Soviet propaganda films spoke about how the peasants now lived in ultra-modern cities, ate at commissaries, collective cafeterias, how they were provided with the same industrial benefits and personal goods that the people in the cities had. Stalin himself would be seen everywhere. This is why if you were in the Soviet Union during the 30s, if you went into a school, you saw a mural in the cafeteria of Stalin with children at his feet and him reading to them. If you went into a factory, you would see Stalin there with blueprints in front of him and the workers standing around him, getting guidance from the great leader. If you went into the farm areas, if you saw in their cities, these agricultural cities, you would see murals on the wall there of Stalin directing the harvest. Stalin would be given what I consider absurd titles. Let me read you some of these. He accepted titles of the cornucopia of science, the father of nations, the brilliant genius of humanity, the architect of communism, the gardener of human happiness. He would be awarded the Stalin Peace Prize and have the prize named after him for future recipients. And of course, numerous cities like Stalingrad would be named after him. What he was creating was what today we call a cult of personality, where the leader or the great leader is infallible, is godlike, is the savior to the people. And this is why during times of hardship, during times of war, people within the Soviet Union and likewise in Nazi Germany would continue to look to Der Fuhrer or Stalin for guidance, for aid, for comfort. They would look to him as the fatherly figure for advice. In some ways, he would become a secular god. Now, Stalin, of course, knew that the cult of personality would only go so far. He had to engender a fear, if you will, a fear that no one would attempt to try and overthrow him. So in consolidating his power in the 1930s, especially after the failure of his agricultural program and the causing such a massive numbers of death in the countryside, Stalin, of course, had to make sure that no one was able to gain the popularity enough within the party or even outside the party to stand against him. So in 1935, Stalin starts what become known as the Great Purges. In 1935, it's the purge of the Communist Party. This is a purge of all party officials that are seen as not being communist enough, or being counter-revolutionary, or being traitors to the party. Now, Stalin is not sitting there in the 1930s naming individuals. Instead, he uses his ability to name trusted advisors to key positions so that they do it. So that they, of course, will take the blame for any misstep. And he doesn't even have to rely upon his trusted officials either. Because this is one reason why historians still study this phenomenon of the purges, because it appeared that many of the people who became victims of the purges were not enemies of the upper leadership like Stalin, but instead were targeted by their subordinates, the people under them. Because if I am working and I don't particularly like my boss, the easiest way for me to have him removed is to snitch on him, to report to his superiors that he is counter-revolutionary, that he is not doing what he should be doing, that he is being a traitor to the class, the proletariat. And of course, they would investigate him and use him as a scapegoat if he did not have the right political connections. If you did not have the right networking, you would easily be used to be made an example of. In 1938, the army was purged, so the Red Army would suffer the same fate as the political party. Again, Stalin used this to get rid of anybody that could stand against him. By 1939, 8 million Soviet citizens would be in Siberia in labor camps. And at least, some people even argue it's higher than this, at least 3 million would be put to death. Now, it's not just purging the party and the army. It's not just creating this cult of personality. As I told you at the beginning of class, many totalitarian or authoritarian leaders try to control the narrative. They can try and control how people think. And one way of doing this is by controlling history. This is a great example of this. The man you see right here, the short little man, is Nikolai Yezhov. Yezhov was a close confidant of Stalin. He was the head of what would become the NKVD, what would later become the KGB, the Soviet secret police. During the political purges of the party, it was Yezhov who took the point of getting rid of Stalin's opponent. Thus, Stalin had plausible deniability. However, by the end of the purges, the bad reputation of this man became a political liability to Stalin, and thus he was purged from the party. He was put on trial, found guilty, and executed. The problem for Stalin is that pictures like this that show him and his close inner circle with Yezhov showed that Stalin was linked to this man, and of course this would not be acceptable. So you see in the Soviet Union, before even the advent of PowerPoint, where photo artists literally removed this man from history. This is why when one of my history teachers in grad school, a guy who specialized in Russian history, went to the Soviet Union right before it collapsed. Actually, I take that back, right after the collapse. This professor, Dr. LaPierre, he told me that when you went into the public archives, the ones that were open to the public, it looked like a 3-year-old had got a hold of the history books. Because they would print these histories, these who's who of Russian history or whatever. Their encyclopedias, for example. But if the entry for Yezhov was initially head of the NKVD and personal confidant of Joseph Stalin, after this man was put on trial and executed, that could not stay in the public history. So the librarians would be given another page, or even just a part of a page, and their job was to cut out the entry for what was politically incorrect and replaced with something that was politically correct, another entry. Maybe not even one about Yezhov, about something else in the wise. Because it had to meet, it had to match the official storyline of the Russian or the Soviet Communist Party. It is the Soviets who actually coined the term politically correct. Whatever was done, whether it be policy or words or histories, had to match what was politically acceptable at that time. Only the secret archives could you find the unaltered histories. Now, the example of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany brings me to a discussion of what is known as a totalitarian state. Because both of these countries, by the 1930s, were totalitarian. What is a totalitarian state? A totalitarian state is a society, not just a government, but a society that is dominated by a central ideology. An ideology where there is always an enemy. In the Nazi Germany, it was the Jews and the Untermensch. In the Soviet Union, it was the traitors to the class and the capitalist. And of course, this society needs to be protected. So you have this messianic leader that leads a trendy group, the Nazi Party and the Bolshevik Party. The party not only is the protector of society, it is the gatekeeper to who is allowed into positions of power. So for you to have access to the upper levels of power, for you to get anything done in society, you must be a good party member in good standing. In Nazi Germany, not everybody was a Nazi here or here, but they were Nazis by membership. A classic example of this is if you guys have ever watch the movie Schindler's List. The first couple of minutes, you see Liam Neeson's character, Oskar Schindler, laying out his suit he's going to wear. He's laying out the gifts that he's going to bribe people with. But the last thing that he puts on is his Nazi party pin, because Oskar Schindler was a card-carrying Nazi. He wasn't a believer in National Socialism, but he was a member of the party, because by being a member of the party, he was allowed into functions. He was allowed access to government officials. He was allowed to be able to facilitate his business. Because if you were not a member of the party, and certain people were excluded, they could not join the party. If you were not a good communist, you were not allowed to be a Bolshevik. If you were a Jew in Germany, of course you would not be allowed to be a Nazi party member. And thus, you were marginalized. You were pushed to the side of society. You were discriminated against. Because increasingly, in the 1930s, both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union either directly control or co-opt all aspects of the economy and business. In the Soviet Union, all businesses are actually part of the state. They are controlled by the government. There is no free property in the Soviet Union. In Nazi Germany, you have free property. You have businesses that are owned by people, but you must get a special license to work, to have it, you have to have a business license. You have to adhere to government regulations, and increasingly in Nazi Germany, these regulations not only include labor laws and things like that, but if you hire Jews, you must fire them. In a totalitarian state, the communications network, the media, is dominated by the party. In the Soviet Union, all papers are owned directly by the state. In Nazi Germany, the papers are regulated to such a degree that only Nazi-affiliated papers are allowed to be published. By 1937, the Germans take it one step further. They introduce this right here, this kind of bland-looking radio. In 1937, the Nazi-dominated parliament in Germany passes a law where all Germans are forced, under penalty of law, to turn in any radio built before 1937. And in exchange for these older radios, they would be given free of charge this new ultra-modern radio called a Volksempfänger. The Volksempfänger literally translates to People's Speaking Box. Now, the Volksempfänger was a way for the German Nazi Party to control communications, because it was hardwired to not receive anything but German stations. Thus, you couldn't receive BBC or French stations or even American stations, because it was intended for a direct communication from the Nazi Party to the German people, not for them to hear independent media. We see this in this poster right here. Listen, Germany, to your Führer with your Volksempfänger. And as you see, the masses symbolically clustered around this box, the speaking organ of the Nazi Party. Now, as I've already mentioned, in a totalitarian state, religion, clubs, and all other associations are either banned, taken over, or co-opted by the state in a totalitarian system. In the Soviet Union, religion is effectively banned because communism is an atheistic religion. All clubs in the Soviet Union are, of course, through the Bolshevik Party. In Germany, they allow religion to stay in place, but it would be heavily taxed unless it towed the Nazi Party line. That's why some religious clerics, some religious leaders flee Germany, because they refuse to toe the Nazi Party line in fear that they will either be taxed to death or imprisoned. Clubs like the Boy Scouts are banned and replaced by the Hitler Youth. So you effectively control where people work, what people hear, and who they associate with in a totalitarian regime. what you want is not just to control what people do, but who they are. You want to control how they think. You want to mold them to accept the central ideology as if it is a God-given message. The party becomes the church. The central ideology becomes the secular religion. And in order to enforce this, the totalitarian regime not only co-opts all of the civil aspects of society, but also takes control of the police and the military. So what is America's response to the rise of totalitarianism? Well, America is still very much isolationist during the 1930s. Americans feel that they do not want to get involved in European matters, that Europe had suckered them into one world war. They don't want to get suckered into another one. Instead, Americans focus on the Western Hemisphere. During the late 1930s, about 1935, 1936, Franklin Roosevelt initiates what becomes known as the Good Neighbor policy. This is a policy that is directed at, of course, bridging the gaps and building relationships with Latin American countries in Central and South America. You see the creation of what becomes known as the Pan-American Conference. The very first Pan-American Conference is held in the late 1930s, a conference that includes every country in the Western Hemisphere. The United States, of course, creates the Pan-American Conference, but of course it invites other American countries, including Latin American countries, to join. In order to assuage these Latin American countries of America's good intentions, FDR declares a non-intervention policy in Latin America. So instead of invading Honduras or the Dominican Republic like America had done in the 1920s, the U.S. government declares that we will not interfere in the internal policies of Latin American countries, the notable exception being Panama because of the Panama Canal. You also see what becomes known as the American First Movement. The American First Movement, of course, will reach its height just prior to American entry in the war in 1941, but it gets its start in the mid-1930s. In 1935, Gerald P. Nye, an American senator, holds a series of Senate committee hearings looking into the American entry into World War I. What Nye's committee finds out and publishes is that American banks, American manufacturers, acting in concert with the British and the French, had pulled America into a war that was not necessary. It wasn't an American war. As a result, in 1935 and 1936, you see the passage of the Neutrality Acts. The Neutrality Acts, as originally stated, say that the United States forbids any American country from doing business with any belligerent. So if a country goes to war with another country, the United States government forbids American banks from lending it money, nor can American manufacturers send it any war materiel. So America is basically declaring that we are going to stay out of everybody else's business in Latin America and in Europe. Now, not all Americans agree with this idea of staying out of Europe's problems, because World War II actually has a precursor war, the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War began in 1936, July of 1936. A Spanish general in command of Spanish North African possessions, Spanish Morocco, crosses the Straits of Gibraltar and initiates a civil war against the left-leaning Republican government. This general's name is Francisco Franco. Franco was a fascist, and his purpose was to stage a military coup and create a fascist country in Spain. Between 1936 and April of 1939, so just prior to the beginning of World War II. Spain undergoes a very brutal, destructive war. And if you guys will hold on just a minute, I am using my laptop for notes, and the battery just said that it's about to die. So I am racing the clock to get it plugged up. Hold on. Okay. I won. Okay, let's get back to the lecture. Now, to make a long story short, many Americans, especially left-leaning Americans, so those Americans who favor left-leaning politics like American socialists and even communists, will travel to Spain and will form what is known as the Lincoln Brigade. These are American volunteers who will fight on the side of the Republican government against the fascist Franco. However, the Republican government will fail. They will lose, despite the help of the Lincoln Brigade, despite the fact that they received military aid from the Soviet Union. They will not receive any aid from the British, the French, and especially directly from the United States. Franco, on the other hand, receives direct military involvement of both Italy and Germany. By 1938, the German Luftwaffe effectively becomes Franco's air arm, and the Italian Navy, as well as its Air Force, will blockade Spain, thus securing, basically meaning that only aid coming from the British or from the Germans and the Italians go to Franco, but the Republicans are not receiving aid themselves. So by 1939, the Republicans collapse and the fascists take over. While the latter stages of the Spanish Civil War are going on, Germany is starting to expand itself. In 1938, Germany absorbs Austria. Now, if we can go back to the map here, the post-war map, Austria. In the summer of 1938, Austria and Germany are formed in what is known as the Anschluss, or the joining. Under the Versailles Treaty, Austria could not join Germany. So theoretically, both Great Britain and France could have declared war on Germany for breaking the Versailles Treaty. However, they do not. And thus Austria becomes part of Germany. Soon after the Anschluss, Hitler starts arguing publicly and railing against the Czech government for oppressing the German minority in this part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland is made up primarily of Sudeten Germans, ethnic Germans, who had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and never part of Germany. But Hitler argues that the Germans should be part of a greater Germany, that they should rejoin. Again, he's trying to make it sound like they had been taken from Germany. Should be able to rejoin Germany. And of course, not just the Sudeten Germans, but their land. So, throughout the late summer and early fall of 1938, Hitler demands that this area be returned to Germany. And, well, he threatens war. Well, in 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, as well as the French leadership, wanted to avoid war. And Neville Chamberlain actually is the prime mover in this of setting up what becomes known as the Munich Agreement. In late August of 1938, Chamberlain will meet with Hitler in Munich, Germany, so right down here, and hammer out an agreement whereupon the Sudetenland with its population will be returned to Germany with a guarantee that the Germans will require no more land aggrandizement, no more territory. And most famously, of course, Hitler signs off on it, and Chamberlain returns to Great Britain, waving the agreement in the air, saying, "We now have peace in our time." Well, Neville Chamberlain was very much wrong, because almost immediately after the Sudetenland is turned over to Germany in late 1938, in early 1939, German forces march into the Czech part of Czechoslovakia, taking it over. So all of this right in here becomes part of the Greater Germany. Slovakia is made a puppet state, meaning that while they are technically an independent country, Slovakia answers to Germany. So within just a year, Germany takes over Austria and takes over Czechoslovakia. It is expanding into Eastern Europe. Whoops. Now, while this is going on in Europe, aggression is also being seen in the Pacific. We often think of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union as a totalitarian regime based on a racial or class-based ideology. But we rarely think of the Japanese as that. But in my view, the Japanese were just like them. The Japanese had their own racial hierarchy, believing that the Japanese people were superior to all, especially the Chinese, who they characterized as dogs. The Japanese wanted to force out the invading Europeans and create their own empire in Asia and the Pacific. In 1937, the Japanese had already taken over Manchuria. And I apologize, I don't have a map handy without getting out of this slideshow. They'd already taken over Manchuria, which is today northern China. In 1937, they start a war, the Sino-Japanese War, with the nationalist Chinese government. They take over what is today Beijing. They take over Shanghai. They take over all of the major coastal regions of China in short order. On February 1938, they march inland to Nanking, which at the time was the capital of nationalist China. The nationalist government flees, leaving the population to the Japanese. What happens during what becomes known as the Rape of Nanking can only be described as horrendous. The Japanese use area bombing to bomb the city, even after resistance had collapsed and the nationalist Chinese had retreated. When Japanese soldiers move into Nanking, wholesale looting, rapes, and murder take place. Babies are murdered, and we know this because the Japanese take pictures of this. They use babies as bayonet practice. They tie Chinese men, whether they be soldiers or not, to poles and use them for bayonet practice as well. It is an absolutely horrendous war atrocity. And what's sad today, the Japanese even today refuse to recognize what they did during this time period. It is not in Japanese school textbooks. So the Japanese are on the march in Asia. The Germans are expanding in Europe. So by 1939, this is the layout, political layout of Europe. As we see, Great Britain, Portugal, France, Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Baltic states, and Turkey are the only governments that are parliamentary in their form, meaning that the people have some form of input. Fascist dictatorships in Italy, Spain, Germany. Communist dictatorships in the Soviet Union, but military dictatorships or monarchies supported by military dictatorships here in Eastern Europe. So here's the irony of World War II. What starts World War II? It is not Germany invading France again. Instead, it is Germany, a fascist dictatorship, invading Poland, a country dominated by its own military. To understand the origins of World War II, the direct origins of World War II, again, we must look back to the Munich Agreement. So I'm going to go back to the map here, guys. I should just move this map to where we're talking about. Actually, we got a map. There, we'll use this map. Germany, as you can see on this map, has absorbed Austria, the Czech part of Czechoslovakia, and the Slovakia is now a puppet state. After World War I, Eastern Silesia, what becomes known as the Polish Corridor, is given from Germany, or forced from Germany, to reconstitute Poland. Many of the individuals who live right in here are German. And like the argument in 1938, Hitler and the Nazis argue that this part of Poland must be returned to Germany. Of course, the Polish government refuses. The Poles are stuck in a very sticky situation. While opposing Germany, they refuse to side with the Russians, the Soviets. Because, again, Poland had been dominated by the Russians prior to World War I, and the Poles fear that the Soviets want to take them over again. The Poles were right. We know because of the opening of the Soviet records after the Cold War in 1989 that Stalin and the Soviets desperately were trying to figure out a way of invading Poland themselves, to take over what had once been Russian territory. This is why, in 1939, in August of 1939, the Nazis, led by the foreign minister, a fellow by the name of Ribbentrop, meet with the Soviets in Moscow, the Soviets being led by a fellow by the name of Molotov. These two foreign ministers hammer out what becomes known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Now, it is made public on August 30th, 1939. Now, what is made public is a pledge by both countries not to go to war with each other. However, there's a secret clause that is not made public. The secret clause says when the Germans invade Poland, that the Soviets will invade from the other side, and the country, Poland, will be divided between the two. This is not made public. As a result, the old Western allies, the British and the French, do not know that the timetable for the invasion of Poland has been already set. They don't know that the two armies are already massing, ready to take Poland out. Because in the late summer and early fall of 1939, the British and the French, driven by public opinion, the British public, for example, were aghast at the Munich Agreement and what happened to Czechoslovakia. So the public in Britain and France start pressuring their governments to take a harder line with the Germans. And as a result, not realizing that war was already preordained, the British and French governments pledge to defend Poland. This is why when the Germans invade on September 1st, 1939, the Germans will quickly destroy Poland. By the end of September, the westernmost portion of Poland will be in German hands, and by October, the easternmost portion of Poland will be in Soviet hands. Despite the fact that Poland collapses so quickly, the British and the French declare war on Germany just a week after the invasion on September 1st. So by September 7th and 8th, World War II has started. Now, does this mean that German armies roll into France immediately? actually from September of 1939 until May and June of 1940. The opposing sides, the French in the Maginot Line and the Germans across the border, sit and stare at each other in what becomes known as the Phony War, because no fighting on the Western Front is taking place. Instead, the Germans catch the Allies off guard by invading Denmark and Norway, two countries that had declared their neutrality. They were out of the war. They were sucked in by a German invasion. This, of course, causes the British to try and help out Norway and not send its troops immediately to France. So when the Germans invade in May of 1940, their opponents are not ready, caught off guard. The Germans actually attack where the French are at the weakest. They invade here through Lower Belgium and Luxembourg. The Maginot Line, which had been built right here, was bypassed. By June of 1940, the French government asked for an armistice with the Germans. The French government falls apart. The government that had started the war under, hold on a minute, it was Paul Renault, I'm pronouncing this right, and I believe a fellow by the name of Charles Daladier. That government falls apart and is replaced by a former war hero of World War I, but a man who is sympathetic with the ideas of Hitler. A fellow by the name, this should sound familiar, Philippe Pétain. Pétain is the person who orders the French out of the war and asks for an armistice with the Germans. Now, next class period, we'll finish up talking about how the British are forced off the continent, how Germany winds up invading Russia, and how America reluctantly enters the war. We will pick up with this next class period. Please watch this in its full. I'll see you guys later. Bye.